Welcome to the Peacebuilding Practitioner, a resource page and podcast for people working on conflict, on peacebuilding, and on social justice issues. My name is Björn Eser, and I'm the founder of and shaker and maker behind the Peacebuilding Practitioner. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Peacebuilding Practitioners podcast. Season 3 is all about digital peacebuilding, this highly complex, tremendously exciting, often messy and quickly developing intersection where emerging technologies and the digital world on the one hand and conflict transformation, peacebuilding, human rights and social justice work on the other hand meet. Today with me on the show is Grace Connors. Grace is a research assistant at the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland. Grace can look back at a proven track record of researching the proliferation of hate speech on social platforms, and she combines this expertise with a passion for the wider field of conflict transformation and peace building. Grace, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I just highlighted some of the things which I think makes you a very interesting guest today, but there's so much more to you. Can you just tell us a bit more about yourself, what you're interested in and what you're currently working on?
Sure, happy to. I know that a lot of people in the digital peacebuilding space kind of like to put themselves in a camp of, I come from the technology background, I come from a peacebuilding background, and I can kind of do that. I feel like I've been very fortunate to be able to come from both. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I've been coding from a young age, but I also always knew and saw technology as a tool to respond to a lot of social problems that I saw in the world. And so I always kind of envisioned my career being in this sort of social impact tech space. And then when I got to Notre Dame, where I did my undergrad, I came in as a computer scientist, but a lot of friends tell me, hey, you should try peace studies. And when I took my first class, I immediately fell in love. It really made a lot of sense and helped put a lot of language behind the problems I saw in the world around me. So immediately I picked up both majors. And then I was very fortunate to meet Dr. Lisa Shirk when I was a junior at Notre Dame, who is one of the leaders in the digital peacebuilding field. And her class finally gave me kind of that aha moment of a lot of language that I kind of was able to put together a lot of my passions. So from there, I've been working in the digital peacebuilding field. I've done kind of a variety of things, but I'm really interested in how technology drives conflict. So looking at challenges we see on social media with kind of challenges in communication, disinformation, hate speech, and how technology can be used to resolve conflict. So what are tools and platforms that can help with mediation or kind of bringing people together? So I'd say that's broadly where I'm at now. I still work with Lisa in her Peace Tech and Polarization Lab at Notre Dame. We're working on a project to address hate speech on social platforms, trying to develop better AI models to respond to hate speech. And then in my day job, I'm working at the University of Maryland, where we study philanthropy, social impact, and nonprofits. So bringing together still this sense of social impact and how do we use a lot of rigorous data in that space. So many things going on.
Many things, many very interesting things, if you ask me. Grace, there are many topics we could talk about from
Sure.
your brief introduction, but why you're on the show today is because recently there was a launch of a new publication here in Germany, and the title of the publication, Peacebuilding and Disinformation, Taking Stock and Planning Ahead. That's the one I want to talk about today. Who was actually behind this publication and why was it commissioned? Why in general? And why at this moment in time?
The study was commissioned by the Berghoff Foundation and the Platform for Peaceful Conflict Transformation in Germany. And they had put out an RFP asking for the study, citing the upcoming German elections and the rise of disinformation that we've seen in Germany and around the world. And this really resonated with me in my experience. I'm based in the United States, and obviously we're going through our own elections, and so understood that kind of disinformation is a challenge that we see very often. And so I put in for the study. Myself and Emma Baumhofer worked on the study together. She's amazing. When we were given the green light to go ahead, we had a lot of conversations as we started scoping the paper. And we both kind of came to the understanding that we're really at like an inflection point in terms of kind of the state of disinformation response, specifically peacebuilding responses to disinformation. Again, speaking from my own background, I feel like the first time I really became aware of disinformation and sort of fake news, as it was really popular at the time, was in the 2016 elections in the United States. And kind of looking back over the past 8-9 years, We've seen a lot of responses to that, a lot of really good research, a lot of really good programming, but we're still dealing with the challenge of disinformation. We haven't really hacked it yet. So Emma and I wanted to take a step back, especially as we see the field changing a bit with new technologies like AI. So we wanted to take a step back and look at all of the work that's being done in the field and what can we do to improve it moving forward as the landscape continues to change. So that was our ultimate goal, which is where that title comes from.
Yeah, quite a challenge, quite a big hurdle to take, I would say. Before we dive into the details, and especially with, let's say, this peace building glasses, let's probably really start with the very beginning, because in our audience are some people who've never been exposed to digital peace building, what it is all about. Let's probably really look in the beginning about terminology. When we talk about disinformation, this broad umbrella term, for your approach for this study, how did you use the term? What does it cover, and how is it set apart from similar related terms?
Very good question, because terminology is super important, especially in this field. So we set out with a definition of disinformation as false or misleading information shared with the intent to harm. And it's that sort of intent piece that differentiates it from a lot of other online harms that we see. So disinformation is probably most closely related to misinformation, which is also just understood as simply false information. But when misinformation turns into disinformation is when the actor behind it really is sharing it with the intent to harm, creating or sharing it with the intent to harm. But we also understand that these challenges really feed into each other. So someone might generate a piece of disinformation, put it out online, and it reaches thousands, if not millions of people who reshare it, who are now resharing misinformation. Or a malicious actor may take a piece of commonly accepted misinformation and sort of weaponize it and turn it back into disinformation. So they really cycle with each other, and they also tie into a lot of other harms. So we see a lot of sort of hate speech, violent speech, and associated online harms. And so when we were defining the scope of the paper as focusing specifically on disinformation, we saw it as a space where a lot of those harms sort of intersect. And when you look at any sort of peace building intervention, as we did, any intervention that's setting out to resolve disinformation is going to touch on these other harms as well, since they are so interconnected. And so looking at disinformation, we knew we could capture kind of a broader scope of the online space.
That makes sense. And I think it helps to get a joint understanding what are we actually talking about. But if you look at communication, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, it's not a new phenomenon. It's probably been around probably for hundreds of years. Why do you think it becomes so much more of a challenge for social harmony, for living together, for actually communicating with each other in recent days or in recent years? And why does it move more into the focus for, on the one hand, understanding? How does it actually engage with conflict dynamics? How does it become a conflict driver? Where does it become a key conflict driver? And at the other side, what do we need to understand about it better in terms to actually react to it, not in a firefighting way, but in a more systemic way? So why is it more in our focus, at our attention, at our doorsteps right now? And by right now, I mean, as you said, probably the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Big question. I think, with the affordances of social media, we're seeing people have access to information at a scale not seen in human history before kind of the advent of these technologies. I can open my phone right now and be able to read anything about anyone that I would want. And so the scope of, scale and rapid dissemination of information that we see online today has really forced these into kind of new challenges, and they're able to be weaponized in new ways. And it's also interesting because the design of social media also kind of encourages the sharing of false information. We see social media as an outrage machine. So algorithms will prioritize content that provokes emotion in users. And so you might see a headline with some crazy information associated with it, and that encourages you to stay on the platform longer. Versus in the past, if you were just having a conversation with someone, you might not be incentivized to speak in that way. So social media, we've really seen, has been transformative to the way content is shared, sort of just how we interact with one another. Also, too, you see the invisibility of social media. Again, I can go online and I can read a bunch of information, but I can also share information and not really have it tied back to myself. So there's not really any sort of accountability there. And so we see a lot of these online harms, disinformation being one of those, sort of associated with the affordances and design of new technology, which is why it's a really big challenge and something I'm really interested in studying.
If we look at disinformation and try to dissect it a bit, if we look at, on the one hand, the production of the information, of the content, of the piece that is shared, then at the distribution and then at the recipient, at the reader, or at the one who's listening to something, at the consumer, If you look at disinformation, especially in the peace building field, could you shed a bit more light on these three different stages?
That sort of breakdown came from one of the interviews that we did for the paper. I spoke with Karen Bernard, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and HD understands disinformation as a supply chain of disinformation. And I really liked that sort of breakdown and framework. So first you have the production phase, which moves into distribution, which moves into consumption. And so specifically in their work, looking at production, so those who create, the conflict actors who create disinformation, they work with conflict actors on what they call social media peace agreements. And so they'll sit with actors in a country and break down norms for online behavior. They've done this in a few countries, and they've started to integrate this into their broader mediation processes because they've realized that it's seen as a bit of, I believe she called it like a low-hanging fruit way to get into kind of a bigger conversation on mediating between conflict actors. And so you see in, I believe it was 2023 in the Thailand elections, they made like a kind of social media annex to the official elections code of conduct. And then they set up this whole monitoring body to watch and make sure that all actors involved in the election were following the right behavior that they had all agreed to. That is a really wonderful example of how a peace builder can really get at that production phase of disinformation and work with conflict actors on the ground. Then you move into distribution. So how is disinformation shared? And this is both on the actor themselves, but also on, again, the platforms and the role that they play in the dissemination of disinformation. And so HD does a lot of relationship building between tech platforms and themselves and mediators so that the platforms can understand how they perpetuate harms and start kind of identifying the roles and responsibilities that those companies have, as well as the affordances that mediators have in working with actors themselves. And then lastly, you hit kind of that consumption phase. So when it reaches the user and how is it going to impact the individual? And this is where we see a lot of peace building response. A lot of peace building response is really focused on the aftermath of disinformation. So how are people going to be harmed by this and increasing human resiliency? So we see a lot of media literacy campaigns or other things working on like critical thinking skills that work on the user side or the individual side. That's kind of the humanitarian dialogue framework. We broke it down looking a little bit in the paper at three sets of actors. Along with production phase, you have disinformation creators. In distribution, you have our spreaders. And so this is both people that knowingly and unknowingly share disinformation. Because there is research that shows that for the average user, the majority of people aren't knowingly sharing disinformation, but they've built online habits that encourage them to do so. And then lastly, you have the recipients, so the audience who is susceptible to these things. I can stop there, but that's kind of our broad framework that we went into this with.
That's very interesting. Let me just follow up on the very first example you gave, where you said, okay,
Sure.
you were talking about someone who worked on the elections in Thailand, if I got you correctly. And I like the idea of the low-hanging fruit, where you said, okay, we have an election very often in countries, you have these code of conducts where they say for funding, for communication, for behavior by the official players or people associated with the official players, there's a code of conduct, there are certain rules and regulations. But can we extend that to the online platforms? Can we say, what does it mean in terms of wording? What does it mean in terms of content checking for the people who produce election material, campaigning material, exchange platforms? Why do you think they call it a low-hanging fruit to start to talk about disinformation in the online sphere, so to speak?
From my understanding from our conversation is that since social media is so much a part of all of our daily lives, it's a very accessible thing. And so asking someone to talk about or regulate a little bit better their online behavior maybe is a little bit easier than asking for direct reduction in physical conflict, since it's more just word online. I would say that's my understanding of it. But again, I would speak more to humanitarian dialogue for their rich insights on that.
If we look at the production side, where you said, in this example, the producers were known. People or organizations where we know, okay, these are the people we have to talk to. And it was probably people doing it. Did you also look at issues where it was outsourced to AI, where the production just gets a goal, so to speak, and then it can decide by itself, do I do that via text, via picture, via video, via soundbite? Or did you look especially at producers in the traditional term, as in people or organizations?
We were kind of understanding producers as the individual behind it, not a machine, understanding that once it's disseminated, that's more on a human versus on a bot. I mean, in every interview that I did for the paper and every conversation I've had with people in the field in general, people are definitely intrigued by AI. And there's a lot of fear associated with the ability of AI to create more realistic fake content that could be more deceitful. But a lot of the interviews that I had, people were worried that there's a bit of an overhype about AI as well. where, yes, the information might become more believable, but it's still going to be operating in similar pathways. And so the programs that are currently working to address disinformation are likely going to be well equipped to respond to those things, so long as they have kind of continued resources and funding and are given the opportunity to adapt to the changes associated with AI. Versus a lot of funders are getting really excited about AI or using AI or want to address AI, and maybe shifting their grant making a little bit. And so it's starting and spinning up new projects, which is super exciting. But again, a lot of the people that I talk to were saying, hey, our programs are still effective. And so we need to make sure that we're kind of balancing this excitement and fear with consistent approaches as well.
That makes sense. Grace, now that we really have a better understanding of, let's say, the analytical phase, where you said, okay, this is where we said we got a better understanding of what does information actually mean and how does it affect, especially the peace building, social justice, the social harmony field. Now, if we look at the second part of the title, the peace building part, what were some of the main insights where you said, okay, here we really had new insights, new learnings, new takeaway, especially for the peace building field, for individual peace building organizations, or for the wider peace building community?
Well, we, in opening the paper, wanted to understand or make the case, I guess, for why peace builders are really adept at this work. I mean, intuitively, it makes sense to all of us who are in the field since we do this every day. But for anyone who were kind of new coming into the paper, we wanted to make sure that everyone understood the skills associated with this work. And so we really understood peace builders as adept at conflict analysis and transformation. So kind of seeing where conflict is operating, and there's a lot of conflict online, but turning that into something different and finding avenues for change, like we saw with the humanitarian dialogue example. We're also very good at mediation and dialogue, and communication is what the online sphere is. And so how can we model better dialogue online? Also very good at reconciliation. So how can we work in spaces of harm and make sure that people are safe and healing through these conflict experiences? Also very good at storytelling. So how can you use the communication spaces afforded by online technology to weave campaigns or tell stories about how disinformation operates or the harms associated with it? And lastly, my personal favorite, John Paul Lederach, who's a really great peacebuilding scholar, kind of coined this term, the moral imagination, which I thought was really beautiful. And I made a point to include it in the paper. It's essentially this idea that peacebuilders are able to sort of accept the world as it is, accept conflict as it is, but foresee a future world where that conflict doesn't have to exist or where it can look a little bit different. And so kind of bringing all these skills together, we saw peace builders as one of the key groups that are able to work in the online environment as it exists and start transforming conflict. And so when we looked at a lot of different interventions or ways that peace builders can engage, and there's been a lot of great work in this space. Again, I would point to a really great paper from Helena Lawari, who I know you interviewed as well, and Mode Morrison. Helena's from Build Up, Mode is from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue as well. And they kind of had this really great pyramid graph. It's in our paper if you want to read it, of the state of online harms and then associated responses from peace builders on the outside. And so you see things like working on content moderation, digital literacy, depolarization and communication tactics. And it slowly moves down the pyramid to that level of collective transformation. So that idea that I would say of getting back to that moral imagination piece. I think the biggest insight that we came to from the paper is that while a lot of our focus as peace builders really sits at the top of that pyramid, so kind of addressing things like hate speech and disinformation, ultimately we got to move down that pyramid and get to the level of asking how we communicate as humans and how do we process information to make our programming better to ultimately resolve disinformation as much as we can.
Oh, that's very interesting. And you just mentioned The Moral Imagination by John Paul Lederach. Also a book I can highly recommend. I know some people, I think it's one of those books you either love it or hate it.
Yeah.
But it's great in terms of being rooted in the here and now, but thinking and imagining beyond the current limitations and current scissors in your head. The thing I like in there, and I think it's also pretty relevant for us, is peace building and also digital peace building. Is it an art or is it a skill, and how does this come together? So I think it's really interesting, also relating it to the very study we're currently talking about. If we talk about peace building approaches, as you already mentioned, and I'm going to put the link to the report and the visual representation you just mentioned from Helena and others in the show notes. What I find interesting is this combination. Where do we work on personal change? And you mentioned literacy campaign or media literacy campaign and in hate speech monitoring and fact checking. But how do we complement that? How do we move from the individual change, the individual competency, to the more social political or structural ones? And here we said, how do we get to the underlying, the more hard to reach, also the more complex issues? Are there any practical insights from your research where you said, okay, we know many great organizations doing great work very often on this individual change, on this individual silo or cluster of a problem, but how do we move to a more systemic approach that also manages or moves towards tackling underlying more complex root causes, the forces that actually feed the whole system? Are there any new insights from the current research?
That kind of gets at another section of the paper that really gets into sort of cognitive science. So ask how we process information, because we wanted to understand, how do we even process information online? Why is this information being shared? Why are people susceptible to it? And so really got to dive into cognitive science, which was new for me, but it was absolutely amazing. A lot of really great research cited in the paper. So again, go check that out. We wanted to ask a few questions. And so first, why do people share false information? Maybe not necessarily out of belief or just out of habit. And so we found the few main reasons from this research for why people share false information. One is out of a sense of social belonging. You share information because you want your friends to know that you're around and be seen in this space online. We build habits of sharing information. And so you might have a few trusted sources of news that you'll just constantly reshare from because you're used to it. And that goes along as well with a high level of trust in institutions leads to a high level of sharing of false information. So if you're not continuing to interrogate your sources of news, you might be more susceptible to sharing false information. And then the other two that stood a little bit apart from those other more habitual reasons that get more at people that share information intentionally was both this idea of outrage and what some researchers called a need for chaos.
Okay.
A new term for me as well. But it's kind of people who feel as though their standing in society is wrong. There's some sort of need of theirs that is not being met. And so they have a need for chaos to share false information knowingly to sort of disrupt that environment and challenge their current social standing. And I think that's something we see a fair amount online. If you kind of start looking for it, you'll start picking up on it.
I think at the moment also offline a lot. I think this alpha male, the big disruptor story, I think is pretty prominent. Yeah.
And that, I mean, I guess that kind of goes back to your previous question, like why this moment is this so important? And I think it's because we see a lot of online behavior cycling into offline behavior and vice versa. There's not really a way to distinguish between the two spaces anymore. It's not just online disinformation, it's kind of disinformation as a whole. Those were the main reasons we saw for why people shared false information. And then when you look at the research for why people are susceptible to believing false information, so not just seeing it, but trusting it, and it plays into similar skill sets and habits. One is a failure to think critically. So same thing as not really interrogating your institutions of trust. You also don't really think that critically about what you see online, kind of passively accept information. And I will say this research was a little bit tempered by country context. So it ranges depending on where you are. So something to look into. People also believe false information if there's a broad perception of social consensus. So again, do my friends believe this? Then maybe I do too. There's also one that's super critical right now, the idea of prior exposure. So if you've seen a piece of false information before, maybe the first time you saw it, you knew you didn't believe it, but later on, you'll see it again. And as you see it more and more times, it builds up kind of a kernel of truth in your mind. And so this one is really important to recognize in this field, especially because there's the habit of online users to share false information as a sort of joke. So like I'll see a piece of false information and think that it's maybe funny because it is so outrageous. And I'll reshare it to my friends, but in resharing it, you're ultimately making your friends more susceptible to that false information and yourself. So a good note to be kind of conscious of our online behaviors. People also be susceptible to it because of a sense of partisanship or group identity. So similar to if my friends believe this, I'll believe this too. And then also if we rely too much on emotion over critical thinking in terms of accepting information. And so we built out this really big map in the paper of reasons why people might believe or create false information and why people might be susceptible to it. But in doing that, you can start to break down opportunities and avenues for response as well, or start targeting responses to specific motivations. And so I would say that was one of the big insights of the paper, and one of the purposes of the paper in general was how do we start making programming more effective? And so I would say those reasons are useful.
I think that's super exciting, especially when I read the paper. I mean, I read it just when it came out, when the launch was, and I read it again, obviously, for the interview here. And for me, this whole cognitive science also was mostly new. And having it nicely, accessibly laid out, what are actually and evidence-based, what are actually motivations, what are actually encouragements, why do people act in a certain way, especially in this spreader field, where you say we have evidence that the majority of people don't share misinformation or disinformation knowingly, willingly, with the intent of harming. But still, we do it, all of us, in our bubbles and between bubbles. And I found it really helpful also for my own work, also for my own behavior, for checking my own behavior, to just see, okay, what are some of the patterns that you identified or that other researchers identified and you nicely collected and displayed in an easily accessible way. So I can strongly recommend to anyone to have a look at it. It's very good general knowledge, I think. You just said one of the main takeaways came from this field. And I guess that was for the takeaways in the recommendations for the field. If you look at yourself personally, I mean, you've been involved in this field from very early age. You said you come from the coding side, you come from the programming side, but you also had an early passion for social justice, peace building, social harmony work. What was for you the main eye opener, the main aha moment?
What a good question. Since I've been in this space so long, I kind of take for granted my awareness of all of these online harms. So, especially digging into the cognitive science piece, since that's not a space I've researched before, kind of just applying all of the lessons to my own online behaviors was really useful. How do I share information? Am I inadvertently encouraging my friends to believe the wrong things? And so I think that was the biggest aha moment, but as well, understanding both that it's on the users, but the platforms themselves to start responding to these problems. So we can be aware of our online behaviors, and I can work on not sharing funny news stories with my friends. But ultimately, we're going to need platform-wide change as well, so that that divisive content isn't prioritized anymore. And so, if anything, gave me another push to be supportive of platform-level change and algorithm-level change, as well as advocating for kind of human behavior change as well.
We're slowly coming to an end, but a few more questions. And one thing I was wondering, I have an amputation, so I'm also active in the disability rights field, disability activism. And for me, I'm always struggling a bit in that field because there's this one mindset, which I generally quite like, is this the biggest disability is the wrong mindset. Yes, obviously there are physical limitations, but very often the limitations are more in the head. And if someone has the right mindset, you can get over the limitations, which I said generally I quite like. At the same time, that puts all the responsibility and also if it doesn't work, all the blame on the individual. So, or you just didn't try hard enough. You have the wrong mindset. And I think that's wrong because disability doesn't take place in a social vacuum, but it's what is around. How's the health system? How are attitudes? What about accessibility? What about labor laws and all these things? So I'm always torn between this, yes, individual responsibility and social responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And once I read the report and once I looked at our own behavior in the peace building field, as you said, media literacy campaigns, working with questioning our own critical behavior when we consume or when we spread and consume media. Well, I think, again, we have something which is a system which can cause havoc and parts of the risks and parts of the threats are built into the system. And we try to address it very often from the individual responsibilities point of view. Oh, we as consumers need to be more critical. We as spreaders need to be more critical. Oh, we need to work with ABCD as individuals or as small groups. Yes, there is an aspect. But again, it lets very often the bigger systems that like a feudal estates where we are just active, it lets them off the hook. How did you deal with that in your research?
Again, a very good question. I mean, I think it gets back to what I was saying before of the lessons learned can be easily applied to one's own habits online, but ultimately they're going to need to be put into broader systems-based solutions to make the environment safer for everyone online. I think that came out a fair amount in our recommendations at the end of the paper. And one of those big ones is encouraging long-term systems-based solutions. So working with existing frameworks, we know a lot of peace builders work on media literacy campaigns or critical thinking skill set trainings, things like that. And peace builders are very good at leading these. But often they're delivered in one-time workshops or in a few weeks and then it's over. And a lot of the conversations that I had with peace builders for this paper who run that sort of programming were saying, yes, this is good. And we see change in our users kind of right away when they take these classes. But these skills need to be practiced forever. You need to be reminded of critical thinking as long as you're operating online and just in the world in general. And so how can we think bigger? How can we integrate this into something like a national curriculum for school children and start practicing these skills every day? And that requires systems change, that requires funding that's adaptive and responsive, that allows people to be able to run this programming for a long time. It requires research on how to access certain areas of the world. And so we work with Policy, which is this really great group. They run some programming across Africa. And they noticed that a lot of their skill-based trainings really focus on women in cities because they're easier to reach. But how do we make sure that this is reaching more rural populations? And so again, it's a multi-step process. The conclusion of the paper really outlines these much better than I can right now. But thinking about how do we go from the individual level and putting the responsibility on the individual to really thinking bigger about broader systems change that we can encourage more concretely.
If we look at the platforms where this takes place and also at recent changes after the elections in the US and tech platforms saying, well, we didn't really do very well before the recent elections, but we decided to try even less. What would be your main call to action, your main recommendation or your main demand towards the providers of some of these big platforms? If we like them or not, they're part of our daily life. And also peace builders who don't like WhatsApp or the meta universe or something, kind of we use it anyway, because that's where people are and where we say we have to meet people where they are. What would be your call to action if you had one or two things where you say, hey, listen to me, I'm Grace and I want you to do A, B, C?
Oh, goodness. If I had a direct line to Elon, what a world that would be. There's so many things to ask for to change. I think with recent changes, the kind of move away from content moderation that we're seeing in the field is definitely worrisome. Obviously, content moderation is a flawed practice. There's a lot of research on that. It's very harming to the individual moderators themselves. It is never fully able to capture kind of all of the hateful content that we see, which is, again, where a lot of my work comes from. But I think the push away from content moderation and kind of the new focus on putting the onus back on the individual and letting the platforms wash their hands of the problem is incredibly frustrating because, again, it goes back to the algorithms that these platforms put in place that are encouraging this sort of hateful content. So if I had one big ask of all platforms, it would be to shift your algorithms away from this sort of emotional-based ranking to bridge-based ranking. And there's a lot of, again, really great research on this from a lot of wonderful digital peace builders. I can share some links that are looking at bridge-based ranking as a way to design social platforms. That would be probably my biggest ask to Elon and Meta.
Just to be clear for the audience, when we say moving away from divisive content that moves up in the algorithm, your definition of bridge-based content.
Sure. So the way social platforms work now is that, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but they prioritize content in your feed that will encourage you to stay on the platform longer. And they do this by kind of hacking our emotions. And so any post that is going to spark outrage or any big emotion in ourselves is going to get prioritized in our feed because that encourages us to stay on the platform longer so they can show us more ads so they can make more money. But that has led to the world we see today, where a lot of content is very divisive and we feel that there's really high levels of polarization online, when in reality, people don't really want that sort of content, at least from my point of view. I wouldn't like that sort of content online. And so a shift from that to bridge-based algorithms is a focus on prioritizing content that encourages dialogue or would find consensus between people and would naturally deprioritize these sorts of polarizing content pieces, so that people have a more positive experience online and you're more encouraged to accept viewpoints and have dialogue with people, and there's better modeling of conversation. Again, I'll share some links on realistically what this means in more technical terms, but that's my basic understanding.
Great. And actually sharing more links and background information would be great. We can put them all in the show notes. Grace, last question, and then we're slowly wrapping up. Just in one sentence, after your research and after the publication of the recent paper, are you optimistic about moving into the right direction when it comes to disinformation and peace building? Or are you rather pessimistic that the peace building field might never be up to the current task when it comes to disinformation and conflict?
I mean, I'm naturally an optimistic person. I think, like you were saying earlier, perspective is everything. And so I'm not one to say that we're completely doomed. And with the amount of wonderful people that I've met in this field and their passion and dedication to building safer online spaces, I think we're going to get there. I have true faith in all of those wonderful researchers and advocates that are doing amazing work every single day, even as changes are thrown at us left and right, and the field is shifting as we're seeing. I mean, again, I'm in the US, so a lot of changes recently. But I mean, ultimately, I have faith. I think there's a lot of potential out there, and I think people are starting to ask for better online spaces as well. So it's coming from the user side, not just from us peace builders.
I think that's a nice closing spirit.
Yeah.
Good. Last but not least, if people now say, oh, that sounds like a very interesting report, do you know where people can find it online?
Yeah, it's on the Berghoff website. So I will share the link with you as well, so you can put that in the show notes. But if you Google Berghoff disinformation, it'll pop up.
Good. Grace, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for sharing. Thank you very much for taking the time. And it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.
So much for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of the future episodes. And I would really appreciate if you leave me a rating on iTunes, on Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more about the Peacebuilding Practitioner, head over to my webpage. That's www.thepeacebuildingpractitioner.org, where you find plenty of articles from practitioners for practitioners. And if you want to dive even deeper into this field of work, join us for one of our online courses. If you want to learn more about that, just get in contact with me. You find the contact details in the show notes or on my webpage.